All right, so with that, here we go.
All right. Just a second. Let me get this from the beginning. All right. Does this look like is it visible to everyone in a helpful way? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good.
All right. So my name is April Casperson. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion in the West Ohio Conference. I'll share a bit more in a minute. And I know some of us, we've all been in the same room together or we're internet friends. So it's good to see all of you as you're hopping on. For housekeeping, I will turn the PowerPoint into a handout and make sure that it's in the documents that you have for this whole conference. And then I just want to say thanks to UMCMA. You let me lurk in the Facebook group. Like I'll share more in a few minutes, but my background is serving in theological education. I've never actually served in campus ministry, but no one has kicked me out of the group. So if tonight I log in and like the group is private, I understand and I respect it, but I care about what you do, and so hopefully I can bring something that's helpful to all of you. And also thanks to Benji for facilitating. Benji and I make up the deacon ordination class of 2011 in the West Ohio Conference. It was like 100 and, oh God, how hot was it, Benji? It was awful. It was
3,000 degrees.
It was awful. But so it's good to be with you in this context. So here's our topic, decentering the self and cultural competency. If this title was public in other forums, people would say that it was all liberal and nothing practical, but we'll keep going with it. So here's our agenda. So first we'll dive in and I'll do a bit of framing. Then we'll talk about clergy, how we are kind of the worst, but we have the opportunity to strive toward perfection, very Wesleyan. And then white clergy, this could be uncomfortable, but that's all right. We are all learners. We'll talk about moving from self-centered to other-centered. We'll look at some data and the developmental model and talk about how to change, and then closing and questions. So off we go. So first of all, I am assuming that some of you on this call are a fan of The Office. A couple of days after the murder of George Floyd, I was added to a new group online, and some of the women in this group might be in it. I won't name it by title, but it was created for women, mothers. It was created to fight racism, and it was racially diverse, and people could invite other people, and there was a bit of screening. And so you could be added to the group. And what happened is that it was racially diverse, and then white women began to enter the space, and white women started to post individual introductions and explain to the whole group how they are not racist. And so it was fascinating because their introductions and their rationales included everything from being married to a person of color to having adopted Black or brown children to having experience in racially diverse workplaces, loving everyone, and really being heartbroken at what's going on and being honest about their vantage point, but really assuming that racism and brokenness in the world was a new thing because they were just now becoming aware of it. So in other words, the women posting were making the case that they are one of the good ones. So we all have good intentions, and they had good intentions as well. But then after about 5 days of all of these introductions and women presenting themselves in the best light, the conversations really began to dig down about white privilege and how white people are called, in our theological language, are called to use their self-professed identity as an ally. And they were using that to shield themselves from deeper self-reflection and then to reward themselves for, as they saw it, not being racist. And there's been a lot of backlash. I understand that you could watch some of the women flounce and leave the group, and I understood why. And then a lot of tension and a lot of pushback saying, well, if we're all just nice, then we can move forward through racial issues in the United States. You may have heard conversations like that in other contexts, including in your current ministry context. So we are in unprecedented times. Here are 30 creative alternatives to the word unprecedented, but we are in unprecedented times. So none of this is new to all of you. So we have the collision of COVID, and we have a new awareness of racial injustice. The work is not new, but new people are becoming aware. And so this is awakening new groups of people to have to resist injustice. So today we're gathered as a group of campus ministers and chaplains and people who care about young adults and young adult formation and education. I know that we are racially and theologically diverse on this call and also as a whole body. And we're also really highly educated. We're integrated oftentimes into academic institutions. We value the formation of young adults. We value the pursuit of vocation and justice. And so as a result, we, and I include myself, we often think that we are already allies, and we think that we're already pursuing a culturally competent life. So everyone is welcome in this webinar. I know a couple of other people have jumped in. I want to say that I'm going to talk primarily to white people on this call so we can dig into how we decenter ourselves from the narrative when we're trying to be culturally competent in our professional and our personal lives. So as an introduction and a bit of background, I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the West Ohio Conference, and I am an ordained deacon in West Ohio. I've been in this role in West Ohio for not quite 3 years. So before that, I served at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, most recently as VP of Institutional Advancement. So I work with everything from recruitment and enrollment to alumni relations and fundraising. And I really do care deeply about theological education still. So for context, for fun, I do still subscribe to the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, so I need more hobbies. But I'm sharing that to say that I really do care about higher education, and especially watching the changes in enrollment bubbles, changes in figuring out what is the most ethical way to provide educational opportunities for young adults and jobs for administrators and for faculty. Like, I care. And I'm also a woman of color. My dad's side of the family is Black with a bit of white and Native American, and then my mom's side of the family is white. So I identify as a woman of color, and I'm also deeply aware that depending on the context, I may or may not be perceived as a woman of color. And in some ways, I'm very white. Before we started this call officially, I was joking, but not really, with Benji talking about like being in this role and doing this work has made me grapple even more with my racial identity. I had a colleague who asked me to read a name aloud, and I said the last name Hernandez, and I said it like that, like. So I live in multiple worlds. So this is who I am, and this is what I'm bringing to the table. So also, I've never shared any form of this presentation with any other groups. So here we go. So we are leaders, and we are going to talk about white people today. As an aside, when you Google image search white people, you don't get pictures of white people. You get a bunch of diverse pictures of people of color, and then like 2 pictures of Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility. And I was like, well played, Google, well played. But if you search for white people stock image, this is what you get. I thought it was fitting. So last fall, I was invited to come to a conference in Toledo, Ohio. It was a multi-day conference for Black and African American leaders and allies. So it was a diverse attendance group, and it was intended for leaders who were trying to climb up the corporate ladder and aiming for the C-suite. So the theme was diversity and inclusion. So they had a bunch of diversity and inclusion professionals from Marathon, from large colleges and universities, from corporations, from well-known nonprofits and healthcare systems, and then they invited me. And when I got the call, I was like, why are you inviting me? My context is so small compared to these other settings. But they explained that they wanted someone from a religious field to talk about cultural competency because they suspected that we have, in my language, implicit biases, and we have a really complex system. That is true. So the attendees at this event worked primarily in colleges and universities, so a lot of them would understand what you're doing, and then also in corporate settings and nonprofits. And so I had to think through how to explain who we are as the United Methodist Church, and then in the West Ohio context. And I realized that as I was articulating that what I wanted to explain about who we are in terms of diversity and inclusion, I had to talk about how we have really high aspirations as leaders and as an organization, and how we don't meet those aspirations. I'm talking about everything from theological grounding to striving for Wesleyan perfection to things that are in the Book of Discipline and the Book of Resolutions and the way that we act as individuals and as a whole at places like General Conference. And so I realized that I was not there to preach. I was not, and I could not, neither did I want to stand up there and have a smoke and mirror presentation. So I had to be honest about who we were. So I got up there and I said, we have not figured it out, but we realize that our biggest roadblock has to be turned into our best asset. And so here's the grounding for this presentation. Our roadblock for diversity and inclusion in campus ministry and for all ministry leaders is that we are highly educated and we are deeply relational and we have strange and particular skill sets. So we often think we know what we're doing. Oh, that was fancy. So if you have been working with a board of ministry or a credentialing group, you've heard of Dr. Matt Bloom and his research. So he is a researcher and his wife is a United Methodist elder. And he has devoted his life and research to learning about how those of us in emotionally challenging fields find fulfillment and flourish. He primarily, if I recall correctly, he focuses on clergy, social workers, and medical professionals, I believe nurses. So if you've been working with your board of ministry, especially the last 3 to 5 years, you're seeing this research and you're probably applying it to things like clergy recruitment and clergy effectiveness. But he and his team are writing about what it means to flourish in vocation. And so he talks about how clergy are code switchers. So as clergy, we have to code switch multiple times a day. It's more than a social worker. It's more than a nurse. And so this is our primary skill set. Whatever our ministry setting is, whether you're a chaplain or a campus minister, or whether you have experience in a local church or in a setting in extension ministry or beyond local church, you need to have technical skills, but your vitality and your ability to flourish comes from the ability to code. This is a wonderful skill set, and people will often tell you you're really good at what you're doing if you can code switch, even if you're not a great preacher or if you're not great at pastoral prayer or pastoral leadership or other leadership in other settings. But people will recognize that you can do different things and they'll praise you for it. So we look at ourselves, and because of the nature of our work, we are set up to assume that we are one of the good ones. And that often translates into cultural competency. And we start saying that I'm an ally. We are the first to often credential ourselves as anti-racist. But truly being anti-racist means that you receive that title from someone who can vouch for you and for the way that you travel in the world. And it requires receiving the title of being anti-racist from someone who is not like you. So I'm going to talk briefly about the West Ohio context because there are a lot of things that translate probably to your context. So I'm sharing this slide about West Ohio because I want to talk about the context in West Ohio. So yes, the conference covers 2/3 of Ohio, and it's a large conference. We probably have more like 110 to 1,010 churches to 1,020 churches after the last couple of months. But we're working with 900 active clergy, probably 1,200 if you move into people who are in retired status and other status. But the reality is that our congregations are 94% white and our clergy are 9% clergy of color. So just by definition, this is a structurally white environment. That may align with many of your academic settings once you get into executive leadership. So being white means that you don't have to be self-reflective. I know that that sounds like a harsh statement, but it's a part of the culture of being white. One of the books that I read recently, and I read it with my book club with dear colleagues who are true friends, Waking Up White. And it was, like I shared with you my racial background, like I identify as a woman of color. And I know that parts of me are really white and parts of me are a woman of color. It was really saddening, but also profoundly helpful for me to listen to other colleagues who were white honestly say, after reading the book Waking Up White, They never thought about race until seminary. So not even in college, even though they went to colleges that were racially diverse. And then they only noticed it because they were confronted by people of color to say, you need to think differently. And then they deliberately chose not to think about it because it was so foreign and so hard. That was hard for me to hear, but I needed to hear it because I recognized that if you are white, you may not have to think about race until you get to college or grad school. And even then, it may not be a critical reflection of race and how your life has been shaped by your whiteness. So this is not new to most, if not all of you, but culture is like being a fish in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water until you take it out. Culture is ever present, and you don't realize it until you're in a different setting. And to that end, I'm sure many of you have tried to cultivate environments in your campus ministry settings. Culture can either be designed or it happens by default. So I talked about how our greatest weakness as clergy leaders is also our greatest strength. We are people, we love facts, and we often act like we are Teflon when we are confronted with our own privilege. And I'm including myself as well. But this is also our strength, even when we are in a culture that doesn't bring this to the forefront and make us reflect upon it. If I can just be honest, not that I've not been honest before, we are people of the mind. I have not been directly in campus ministry, but I watch what some of you do online and what you share. You are practical theologians. You are on the ground. You are making meaning and you are observing. You are gathering data and you are responding every day, and you are practicing code switching with talking with the leaders in your academic institutions, your students, your graduates and alumni, and everyone in between. And we are United Methodist. We are methodical. So the point of this work is that recognizing and honoring that decentering ourselves from our own story and journey to cultural competency, this takes time and it is a developmental process. You can't just read a book and fix your own white privilege and white centering. And I have to say that for all of us who either, whether you're lay or clergy, you've gone through or you're going through a formation and discernment process to determine what your role is and what your call is. Decentering yourself from the story of your life, especially in terms of ministry, is the opposite of how we were formed, because we were all shaped and formed in a way to learn how to articulate who we are, what our gifts and graces are, how we need to engage with teams to strengthen the parts of ourselves that aren't strong. Decentering ourselves from the story is the opposite of how we've been formed. And we're shaped and formed in a way that we can practice humility, but we also tend to assume that we've earned everything we've received, whether it's a credential or a degree or a position. So the goal is to move, but growth takes time. There we go, a little stock photo. So the goal right now, what we're going to talk about for the next couple of minutes, is how to move from being self-centered to other-centered. And I also recognize, like I turn 40 next year, so probably the pictures that I think are funny to myself may or may not be funny to you or to young people. So if my graphics are silly, I ask for your grace. So what we're going to do is we're going to do just a 10-minute overview of the intercultural development inventory. I think I met with some of you 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when you met at Methodist Theological School in Ohio for your session. And then a few of you I may have encountered in other settings. So I promise not to redo a presentation that you may have heard before. The Intercultural Development Inventory is a tool we use in West Ohio and across the connection. There are 14 to 15 staff, kind of like me, in other annual conferences. When you think that there are, 63 or 66 annual conferences, that's not a lot. Not that you can solve racism and diversity concerns by hiring someone to work with diversity and inclusion or multicultural vitality, but there's something to be said when resources and a staff person has been assigned to do this work. So I'm going to talk about why the IDI matters and what it is, and then we're going to apply it to decentering ourselves from the conversation when we're trying to be culturally competent. So just for background, the IDI, ooh, bouncy, forgot I created it this way. The IDI, it is an assessment, not a test, although everyone calls it a test. And just if this is interesting to you, it's based in grounded theory. Grounded theory is about storytelling and making your own meaning, but also gathering meaning from other people's stories that may be different from you. And it identifies development and it raises cultural awareness. And it is designed in a way, even with its corporate speak, the focus is on potential and growth. So it is actually Wesleyan if you interpret it in that. So I'm going to explain two slides. This slide and the next slide, they say the same thing, but in two different ways. So the IDI is based upon a continuum, and it describes how we, as individuals or as groups, react to difference. The process is that individuals take an online assessment, and then you can either get an aggregate of a whole group, whether it's a group of 5 or a group of 500, or you can get your individual report. So there's 5 placements on the continuum, moving from denial all the way to adaptation, and I'll explain what each of them are in a few minutes, and we'll dig into them. And I just want to mention, here's the continuum in another late 90s kind of awkward graphic, but it's helpful because it shows that there is movement. I want to mention that this is a continuum that moves from monocultural to an intercultural mindset. And depending on the situation or the topic, an individual or a group can move back and forth on the continuum. We'll dig into this a bit more. So what we're going to do is talk about the different placements on the continuum. So the first placement on the continuum is denial. And before I jump into these, there is no moral or ethical or theological weight to any of these placements on the continuum. So it's not that you're bad or good if you're on the continuum, but a denial mindset really would represent an individual or a group that is either utterly unaware or utterly hostile to any form of difference. Someone who would be hostile would be, hypothetically speaking, an employee in a college environment who is asked to go to a one-on-one for cultural competency and diversity training, and they sit across from someone like me who is assigned to talk with them about their results, and they sit across from me and they cross their arms and they say, I'm just going to sit here silently for 45 minutes, so you can either dismiss me or I'll just sit here for 45 minutes to fulfill the requirements. So actively hostile. Or I once met with someone who had a background in the military, and he talked about how they actively ignored differences between people in their cohort because the primary focus was to get the job done. That was a very helpful explanation for me. Someone who was in denial, but it wasn't malicious and it wasn't deliberate. It was more of a mindset of, I'm here to do a job. So if you have a group or an individual in denial, which you can probably imagine some of your students being in denial, the growth strategy is simply to help that person notice and engage cultural differences, to think for the first time that other people may have had different kinds of experiences. So this is a pretty little graphic about denial. Don't need to worry about that. So polarization is, it views cultural differences from an us versus them perspective, and it can be in either defense or reversal. So in other words, it could be positive or it could be negative. So polarization is an us versus them. Results of the IDI are confidential. The first time I took the IDI, I was in polarization. I was one of the few people of color in the full group that was taking it, and I was thinking, oh my God, like, I can't believe you're asking me to do this work on behalf of the conference. But then it made a lot of sense. I realized that for me, polarization showed up in 2 ways. Defense, I was in a seminary setting, one of the United Methodist seminaries. And I'm a United Methodist clergywoman. So I would look at students who were coming in from other traditions. I cared about all of them because MTSO had probably like 22 or 23 denominations in the student body. And I had like what would be the opposite of the chip on my shoulder, realizing, well, I come from a tradition that ordains women. And so we're just farther along than some of these other traditions. That's a form of polarization and us versus them. Or sometimes it showed up as reversal. Some of my work at the end of my time at MTSO included fundraising, and I remember working on grants and making asks and thinking, if I was at a different kind of nonprofit that wasn't religious, even though I'm a clergy woman, would we be able to acquire more money and or do more if we weren't a theological school? That's a form of polarization reversal. So when you have a group that is very polarized, and they can be polarized around a topic, or they could be polarized around one topic and stronger in other ways, the goal is to help groups find common ground and to stop them from thinking about an us versus them mindset. So minimization is really in the middle. Minimization highlights commonalities between basic needs and universalism. And so this is an example of someone who may not mean it in a malicious way, but they say, you know, I just don't see color. They think that they're saying something that's very, very helpful and kind and gracious. Or they may be white and they say to a person of color, like, I just think of you as just like me. And they've erased a whole part of someone's identity, let alone how they may look visibly. That's a form of minimization. But it's not necessarily bad, because minimization can be practiced by someone who is an outsider, whether it's about race or gender or generation, as a strategy to go along to get along. I have never served as a lead pastor. I was an associate pastor for about 7 years in college and in seminary when I was discerning whether it was elder or deacon for me. But I have heard from colleagues who have served in pastoral ministry, especially if they are the first, whatever the first may be, that their strategy is to come in and to help people see and think, oh, well, he or she is just like we are, and that's why we can get along. And then one more example. I think that an annual conference session, like the combination of business and worship and fellowship and presentations, I think that's an example of an event in minimization, where even if you have a smaller annual conference, you have a plethora of theological views, you have clergy and laity, people with very different ideas of what it means to be in ministry and be United Methodist. And the goal of that event/business session is to help people see a place where they belong. So it's almost like erasing differences as a strategy. So the growth for a group or an individual in minimization is to help them dig deeper and to help them stop assuming that they know everything about everyone else in the room. See your little graphic for minimization. Two more left on the continuum. Acceptance is recognizing and appreciating patterns of cultural difference and feeling comfortable with diversity. And then if you have groups in acceptance, you want them to recognize that they may be strong in acceptance around one topic or around one form of diversity, whether that's race or gender, theology, politics, ability. The sky's the limit. And recognize that they may not have it all figured out. And then adaptation is really a cognitive frame shifting and understanding how another group or someone who is different may be thinking, and behavioral code shifting. I do want to mention that acceptance and adaptation, it doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with the person or the group that is different. It means that you understand why they think the way that they do. That has been very helpful, especially in our church settings, to explain to church leadership teams, your goal is to be an acceptance or adaptation, but you can still hold on to your core theological beliefs. So this is, we've not done the IDI with you, but what the IDI measures is the orientation gap, which is the difference between the perception, how people perceive themselves, and how the tool places them on that developmental continuum. So the assessment is designed in a way that it balances out how everyone wants to present themselves in the best light as they're answering questions. And then it shows you how you perceive yourself versus where you actually are on an assessment. It is fascinating work because, as I shared earlier, and we are all in this category, we are highly educated, we're highly relational, our skill set involves code switching, we're also really good at managing complex organizations. And then to be confronted with an assessment that says you perceive yourself in one place and the tool places your development in another place is very, very eye-opening. So when groups take the IDI, it's fully confidential. And like if anyone has questions about becoming an administrator or how we're using it in West Ohio, you're welcome to email me and we can Zoom or talk on the phone. The results are confidential. I can say without breaking confidences that many groups show up as minimization. And when I'm talking about groups that I've worked with, I'm talking about churches, I'm talking about staff teams, I'm talking about leadership teams, provisional clergy as a whole, if you take a class of provisional clergy. So part of decentering yourself and growing in cultural competency is assuming that you don't have it all figured out. And I don't mean like the humility that we all say, like, I just don't have it all figured out, but really thinking, you know, maybe because of who I am, and probably / especially because of my whiteness, I probably am not nearly as far along on this continuum as I think I am. So if I were to guess, which I'm technically not supposed to do with my qualified administrator credential, but if I were to run the IDI with everyone who is registered for this whole conference, the group would probably show up in minimization. And leadership and minimization looks like this. It looks like, and like there are no bad people, but and I've made it to minimization. I have moved from polarization to minimization, if I may cheer my own work over the last 2 years. But minimization looks like making assumptions. It looks like having relationships for strategy, but not necessarily with transparency or authenticity. It can look like frustration or utter frustration with initiating change, which I'm sure we all experience as leaders in the United Methodist Church. But it also includes like being comfortable with the status quo. But if you may be someone who does not fit with the norm, or it could be simply the role of being a campus minister or spiritual director or someone tasked with working with ecumenical context, you may have pressure to go along to get along and not necessarily stand for who you are and what you do. And it can also show up as performative justice seeker. So the person who is quick to buy a bunch of books and post a picture on Instagram, and then they skim them, and then they say, okay, I've checked off the box. I bet I'm not racist anymore. So the goal, because this IDI is a developmental tool, the goal is to move out of minimization if indeed you are in minimization. Bounce through. There we go. Fancy. So if we were leaders and we were working through a growth plan, our goal would be to move into acceptance. And so this is what leadership and acceptance looks like, which is, I suspect, what all of us are hoping for and aiming for. You want to have an increased growth mindset. You want to de-escalate conflict within the group. You want to engage in systemic change. You want to try new things. And you want people who have diverse backgrounds to feel valued. And you want to really meet and see people where they are. I suspect that if you're in campus ministry, this is who you want to be and where you're trying to go. So here's how we move into the so what and what next. So how do you get from minimization to acceptance? You have to get motivated and you have to stay motivated. And this isn't a question that you need to answer. Like, we'll have just open question and answer and conversation time when I'm done or get near the end. But you really need to think about what motivates you and why do you want to do this work. And it can be as honest as like, I don't want to look like an idiot in multicultural context, to a strategic goal like I would like my campus ministry to become 25% students of color, and I want it to happen in a healthy way. I want to lead them from the best of my ability, even and especially as a white leader. Like, but you need to think about what your motivation is. In the group that I described when we kicked off this session tonight, I have been appreciating the intense, visceral honesty of many, many white women saying, this is wrong. And I don't even have the words to describe why this is so wrong, but we need to fix it. And then I'm seeing colleagues, white women and women of color, help them figure out, so what is it you want to fix and why? Is it because you want to be comfortable again, or is it because you want justice for all people? So you should think about your motivation. But as a reminder, this takes time, no quick fixes. In West Ohio, we're very, very fortunate. The job I'm in is 6 or 7 years old now. So there was a person in it for a year, and then she became a DS, and then a colleague who was in it for about 3 years, and then he moved to G Corps. And so I'm like the third person in this role, and we've moved it. Long story short, between grant funding and then apportionment dollars and other strategic resourcing, there are 20 cultural coaches. Benji is actually one of them. So we're all what's called licensed qualified administrators of that IDI, but the conference paid for the credential, and then as the staff person, I deploy them out to churches and to other settings and structures within the conference to do this kind of work, whether it's administering the IDI or hosting a conversation or building something from scratch. So we had this asset of 20 people where we put money into it, but then it's actually much cheaper over the long run versus bringing in someone, an expert, and paying them for like a 2-day training that may not do anything. So I share that because, especially in the last 2 months, it's wonderful, but there's an explosion of churches, as I'm sure you've heard, where like they want like workshops and training and anti-racism audits. Like only like 7 of our churches are going to want anti-racism audits because, let's be honest, like our churches are 95% white. But an explosion of churches wanting workshops and resourcing right now. And they want to figure out goals and growth right now. Wonderful young man who I knew from, I won't talk about where I knew him. His little church, mostly white town, they had a Black Lives Matter march. Wonderful. And then he called and it was a good conversation. He's like, okay, so what do we do next? And then we're done, right? And I was like, oh my God, like that's not how it works. This work takes time. And it will also take time for you personally. So in our settings, we ask people oftentimes to take the IDI as a group, and then as an individual, they meet with one of the cultural coaches, and then they meet regularly for accountability and goals and growth. And discomfort is growth. This work is uncomfortable, and it is vulnerable, and it is self-directed, and it's hard, and it works. And I include myself in this. I had a couple of not quite concerns, but just things on my mind when I transitioned from a seminary setting to this. And I knew that part of the work would be my own emotional labor and also my own growth and formation. So I'll simply say that discomfort means that you're doing it right. So for us today, I have a couple of suggestions. So we'll talk about it from a leadership perspective and then from a personal perspective, and then we'll wrap things up for conversation and questions. So you need a process and you need accountability. The IDI is one very good option because it's designed as a tool that can be used internationally. The language skews more toward a business perspective, but it gives you a detailed plan to follow and it's honest. Also, you need data. You need to know who you are. We, as I shared before, our vocation makes us very good at self-reflection, but then it also allows us to craft a vision of ourselves that may not be accurate. You need data. The IDI is a helpful tool that will give you actual information, will actually show your growth. And you need accountability partners, and you need to pay for it. What I mean by pay for it, I don't mean that necessarily in a vindictive way, because the slide about being uncomfortable was the previous slide. But it is good to ask your colleagues, and especially colleagues of color, how you can do better. But that's also trying to dip into their emotional labor. We value things more when we pay for them, whether it's with a coach or whether it's with like an accountability group where you have to set aside time and energy and work through a plan together. So that's what I mean by you have to pay for it. And then I just put this very plainly on the slide. I know I just spent 45 minutes explaining that You have to have a plan and accountability in order to become anti-racist. And like that literally is my takeaway. I know it's not groundbreaking, but holy moly, if people were intentional, we wouldn't need workshops like this. And we all have opportunities to grow. Statements from organizations and especially from colleges and universities are wonderful. But then we have to do something. So here's practical steps for campus ministry. And like I'm speaking as someone who's not served in campus ministry as a vocation. So this is how I'm bringing what I have to you. You're welcome to sift through it however is useful. But stop assuming that you know your context. You're called to be an expert on your context. It's easy to get stats like how many students of color do you have in your school and how many are in your small group or community. I'm sure that if I asked any of you like how many students are in your Wesley Foundation, you can give me stats, you could give me theological background, you could tell me you could probably tell me the Enneagram types of a group of 10 or a group of 50. But then digging into where did they come from, and then also are they all from structurally white contexts? Or are you marketing an assimilation model of church community? I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That could be minimization as a strategy, but if one of your tactical goals is to have more students of color, are you recruiting students of color that happen to go to all white churches? Or are you recruiting students of color that came from different contexts? So I don't have the answer to that question. I don't want to fall into stereotypes, but that's something to talk about. I know it doesn't show up on a dashboard when you're reporting to campus administration, but think about this. And then think about how much do you center yourself when you connect with students. It is really good to practice empathy. The IDI has been helpful for me because especially thinking about minimization, groups in minimization, especially churches or ministry teams, they tend to relate any experience that's different from theirs to their own experience. On the one hand, it's good to find a connection point. On the other hand, their experience, someone else's experience may be so vastly different from yours that you may just have to tell yourself, I don't know what's going on here, and I have to be 100% a learner instead of 90% a learner and 10% a bridge builder. And then for campus ministry, how much do you assume that you understand their context or what they are thinking? On the one hand, if you're called to campus ministry and chaplaincy, you do understand how students think, even though students get younger every year, and maybe it's that we get older every year, but like that's our skill set. But there's your minimization drill down. And then do you talk a lot? I know that sounds flip, but if you're constantly explaining yourself, and it's more than simply pastoral or campus ministry leadership, that might be a red flag. And are you usually comfortable and you assume that you know what is going on? Finally, I know like I have a quote from Robin DiAngelo who wrote White Fragility. She is a white woman talking about whiteness. Like I'm owning that, but this is the quote that I wanted to have. Stop assuming that you're doing it right because you haven't been called out yet. You have to make a plan and take action. I had an experience where a colleague was well-meaning and a colleague sent me a disturbing news story, which was useful. And the question was, have you seen this? I'm like, I saw that 4 days ago, but like, I'm not going to tweet about it because everything is traumatic right now. And then the colleague wanted to make sure that it was important for me to watch the video, which I did not because it would not have been helpful. It doesn't matter what video. And the colleague wanted to make sure that I understood that I needed to understand those viewpoints because other people think that way. And I don't have it all figured out, but it was an example where the colleague was just like, you know, maybe you should think about diversity and inclusion. I'm like, it's my job. Like, I don't have it all figured out, but it's literally my job. And like, I'm not white. In some ways I am white, but like, I'm really not white. But I didn't call the colleague out. Just because you haven't been called out doesn't mean you're doing things well. And the only way you can either be racist or anti-racist, and it's always a growth plan, so you always have to make a plan and take action. So it is uncomfortable, but assume that it's you who may contribute to a difficult environment, and you have to think about being open to feedback. So how I want to conclude is that we're called to ask hard questions of ourselves. And it is tiring and it takes resilience to do this kind of work, but the fruit is so worth it. I think it is deeply Wesleyan to commit to a plan and continue to learn and to name that we don't have it all figured out. And the way that we do that is to decenter ourselves and to stop thinking that we have it all figured out and to really be open to how we can be actively anti-racist. So that's what I have for you. It's not quite an hour, but I figured that people wouldn't be upset if we didn't fill up the whole hour. And so now, open to conversation and topics. I'll stop sharing my screen, but I do want to thank you for your time and your energy, and I hope it was not offensive and helpful, some of the content. So Benji, I'm happy to see however we need to facilitate conversation.
Sure. Thanks, April. April's email is in that first slide that will eventually be shared with you. And she had mentioned that she's open to conversation, however that works. We do have some time. There are about 20 of us. And so I was on one of these earlier this week, and this worked well. So if you want to, raise your hand, use the little hand raisy thing. We can start filtering through those. If we're getting towards the end of our time, or if you need to jump out, you feel free to put a question in the chat, and we can make sure April gets those as well, and you guys can figure out how to connect there. So yeah, let's give it a shot.
I had a question.
Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, okay. Hey, Mark.
Yeah, about the decentering, and this just kind of came to mind as you were explaining this and looking at the continuum as we hopefully move from denial to a place of adaptation. Is decentering, going from one end of that spectrum to the other, is that a goal or is it a process?
It's both. Here, I'll share my screen again so we can look at the lovely continuum. 1 second. From current slide. Nope. I managed to get through seminary before PowerPoint became a thing, so hold on just a second. I'll get back to the continuum here. But it's both a goal and, what do I say? Current slide. There we go. It's both a goal, but it is also a process. A couple of pieces of information about this continuum. You can move back and forth. You can also move forward in one area, but then go backward in another area. Hypothetically speaking, a church, a denomination like the United Methodist Church could be practicing and rock solid in minimization, except around topics of race and theological understandings of the interpretation of Scripture.
Yeah. Well, the reason why that came to mind was it took me back to like some interfaith work that I found myself involved in 35 years ago as I was first trying to think, how do you get out of sort of your centered identity as a Christian, for instance? And, I came across some really good literature back in the day, and it just reminded me of this spectrum of crossing over and coming back. And so that for instance, good example would be Martin Luther King. He crossed over into Gandhi's whole method of aggressive nonviolence, and came back from that enlightened Hindu perspective to become sort of galvanized as a Christian prophet. And there are many historians who say he would have never done that, would never come back to be the great prophet of the civil rights era had he not crossed over and assimilated a lot of what Gandhi was teaching into his own understanding of how he was being challenged to be a better Christian by leading, a movement with a voice of confrontation and yet kind of compassionate confrontation, but nonetheless confrontation. So it was, anyway, I see that in terms of my own interfaith development, that I find myself always on that continuum, but I usually come back to being a Christian. That may change in the near future, but it's more of a process for me than a destination.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really helpful framing. And the strength of this continuum is, as I think I shared earlier, moving toward acceptance and adaptation is more about understanding and frame shifting. You don't have to give up your deeply held beliefs. Like I've shared that with groups of clergy or church groups, and literal relaxation. I'm like, I'm not asking you to not be Christian or to not be who you are. I'm asking you to try to understand why another group may act or think the way that they do.
Yeah, so, and I agree with that, but what would you say about Robin DiAngelo? And I've read her book, and she says the only way that white people can be truly anti-racist is to learn every day more ways to be not white.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I've not read the book yet. Our Connectional Ministries team is going to read it in the next month or two together. But I would not having read the book, I would agree with that, because especially like if we're in an unhealthy state of minimization, we're relating everything to our own context. It's okay to do meaning making, to say, oh, this person may have this experience, I have this experience, therefore we're common, but it still centers your experience as the lens of looking through the world, instead of moving toward that really cognitive frame shifting.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Just looking, yeah. I remember, April, when I went through the training for the IDI, we were led by a wonderful facilitator named Mary Francis. And Mary Francis kept reminding all of the new folks who were doing this, because we would use the language that we're used to when it comes to assessment. Like, and I landed on the continuum at minimization. So I would say, well, I'm minimization. And Mary Francis would say, no, you're not. You're at minimization, because it's a continuum and you can move along the continuum. And one of the biggest things that has been most useful from that training for me when I've talked to people that take the IDI is that, and I think she framed this with personally when I was having a conversation with her, I don't know if it was in the whole group, but the question was, you have to consider, do you want to move on the continuum? Because it takes work. And so, someone takes the IDI, they find out where they're at on that continuum. You talk about the continuum and where they're at and what each thing means. But then you have to have the conversation of, if you want to, the assumption would be made. And I make the assumption because I'd love to move from minimization to adaptation to, or whatever order, I'm not looking at it. But I'd love to make that move. But her comment is not everyone wants to. Or not everyone just even is at that level of self-awareness where it's a real thing. And so it's just an interesting way to talk about when we're thinking of that whole, it struck me when we were talking about decentering of, even to ask that question of, do you want to move, along the, just, it's a personal goal. And I've never asked the question in a one-on-one of, do you want to move? Tell me right now what your goal is. But the question of, you got to take this information and figure out, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to work a plan to move along this way? How does that work for you? Because where you're at on the continuum doesn't define who you are. It defines where you're at. Because we as a group kept saying, oh, well, you're at, or not you're at, oh, well, you are. And she's like, no, you aren't defined by that. You're on the continuum. But then to make that choice of, and it blew my mind that you wouldn't want to move up the continuum, but everyone's different.
Two thoughts. I think many of you on here will find this funny and sad at the same time. The first is we have reframed not this presentation, but the IDI component for other contexts. I do not mean this to be classist, but I trust that you will hear me when we do a different kind of presentation at the second half of licensing school. So all of the people who are in seminary have left, and people whose goal is to be a licensed local pastor, which can encompass a wide array of professional backgrounds, academic backgrounds, but using completely different language, all evangelism and discipleship. and then finally getting them to realize, like, this is diversity and inclusion, and how carefully you have to finesse. And then in church settings, we actually have a slide, depending on the church, to say, is your goal to welcome all people or to change in a certain way, and helping them see that, like, they may think they want cultural competency work, but really they need to do some honest visioning work. Well, and then last thing. And I will just say that, like, profound experiences of active hostility with this work when we have groups who are required to take this. So not church groups, but more internal groups, like groups of clergy or committees or that kind of thing, like where we have presented before, like 2 or 3 cultural coaches using a very churchy model of anything related to diversity and active hostility, like people turning their backs and refusing to engage with us. So I know that this work is hard. There's a part of me where, like, it was really hopeful to be able to talk to campus ministers, because there's a different kind of skill set and willingness to be around different. I see in the comments from Rob, especially, how much capacity do you have to move at this time and how quickly? One of the interesting things about this assessment is if the rote phrase is if you are in certain times or places or situations or seasons of transition, you may move on the continuum. It's interesting because we do use this work with all of our provisional clergy. They skew younger. These are young adults who have had either one vocation or many vocations, have gone from college to seminary, and really reframing who they are. And so we're asking them to take the IDI when they're literally in a season of transition and they're trying to earn their final credentials. So Rob, that's a very good question. Thanks for asking that.
Any other questions for April?
Do you have thoughts or recommendations on, best ways to kind of start this conversation, or resources to start this conversation with young adults?
I think with young adults, you've got to balance, depending on the context. If you have young adults who are willing or interested to do an assessment, you can do this assessment with them. Benji's done that, actually. You can do this assessment with them and then discuss the results. And then when you take the assessment as an individual or as a group, you get this customized document where it feels a little corporate, but it guides you on how to create goals. And it does not create goals for you. So if you had a small group, like, they could create goals together. But you can still do good things by simply reading books. I know that there is a Washington Post or New York Times article saying, like, Black people protest and white people, like, join book clubs. But at the same time, you have to meet people where they are. And depending on your group of students, like, you could read a book a month and talk about it, and really, you can open their eyes. Like, I don't want to say everything is valuable, but sometimes just getting from 0 to something still has value. So have them read like 3 or 4 books and talk about it together, and just ask them to share their stories. But I mean, like, I know this is also my job, but the IDI, it works. It works. And you can take it again. So you could have them take it in October and then again in May and see if they've shifted back or forth. It's fascinating. To me. Maybe not to everybody. Hopefully to Benji, as one of our cultural coaches. Thanks, Benji.
Okay. Oh, sorry. More things going on there. Awesome. I don't see any hands, and which is great. Yeah. So thanks, April. I hope you all found this as fascinating as I did. And as April and I talked when we made the invitation, we realized that in an hour-long session on Zoom, we would not be able to present, here are the 5 easy bullet points to make your campus ministry culturally competent and anti-racist, but at least gets people thinking and gets the conversation started. And so hopefully that's what this happened for you. So we'll share all of this stuff on the UMCMA website sometime late next week, early the week after, once all the sessions are through, which will have all that stuff that April mentioned, her slides as a handout and contact info and all that jazz, as well as the recording of this session. And so, yeah, so thank you. Thank you, April. Thank you guys all for joining. I know we have one more day of workshops and webinars next Monday. Michael McCord will be doing board development and fundraising. And then we'll have a panel that's a pretty sweet looking panel of ministry in new and crazy times. These are folks who have had some best practices over the past 6 months of just doing things differently and well. And then there'll be a coffee and cocktail hour to close out next week. This coffee and cocktail hour will have kind of a dual focus, church-based campus ministers / 2-year colleges. So if you fit into one of those, or if you don't, I totally crashed the chaplain's coffee hour and it was fine. But that'll be the focus of the conversation. And probably the way that one will work is start off together, then split into 2 rooms to just hang out and chat and talk about what life is doing campus ministry, either from a church-based model or at a 2-year college. So hope you all can be a part of those. And thanks so much for making this awesome. And thank you, April, for taking the time.
Well, thank you. So good to meet all of you. Good to see all of you. Good to see you, Nancy and Betsy and Edward. It's like, oh, familiar faces. So, and Mark, good to see you too. So, all right. Thanks, you guys. I'll see you on the internet.
Thank you. Bye, friends.
Bye.